Great. Here's our agenda for today. Again, I'm going to do a quick recap of our drought declaration process and implications for anyone who haven't heard that recently. We'll have Karen from the Washington State Climatology Office. Again, it's still a new name. From the regional overall picture, Matt from NRCS on mountain conditions, Mick from Bureau of Reclamation on Yakima project. And for those that hadn't heard, last year Chris Lynch retired, and so now we thankfully have Mick stepping in for Bureau of Reclamation, Amy from Northwest River Forecast Center on water supply forecasts, and unfortunately Nick from USGS couldn't make it today, but I'll do a quick screen share on some US stream flow conditions and where things are not looking great. And as always, we'll have time to hear concerns from anyone else on the call for other questions or thoughts for drought recovery in water year 2025 at the end. And so again, our Water Supply Availability Committee, or WSAC, provides an important role for ecology in the state on current and forecasted water supply conditions, and at times in which we are considering going through the state drought declaration process, whether we have met the hydrologic drought threshold has been met or is likely to be met. And again, here at this point, we are assessing water supply conditions in Washington in February. And as a quick recap, back in April of last year, ecology declared an essentially statewide drought due to low snowpack and a warm and dry forecast that mostly came true, and we saw impacts for water supply throughout the summer and early fall. And that is still in place through April 15th of this year, 2025. And we are keeping that in place until we see clear evidence of drought recovery. And where there may not be drought recovery or snowpack recovery, we may consider extending this drought declaration in April. And so again, when I refer to this hydrologic threshold here in Washington, we have our definition of drought in state statute. And drought conditions here mean two specific things. First, that an area is receiving or is projected to receive less than 75% of normal water supply. And by normal, that is referring to the average of the 30-year period from 1991 to 2020. And then second, we have a hardship threshold that water users in the environment are expected to experience undue hardship from these water supply conditions. And by water supply, I also like to highlight that there's not one way that we determine water supply. There are a range of different factors that go into that consideration. As we see in these meetings, all the different perspectives and consideration for water supply are important. Some of the main ones, of course, are snowpack, precipitation, temperature, soil moisture, both the water year-to-date numbers and the forecast for those. And back last year in April, that hydrologic threshold for drought was met for these conditions, and we're continuing to watch these conditions for evidence of drought recovery or not in different parts of the state, as we will hear today. And again, the implications of a drought declaration here in Washington state is by state law, that means two things happen. One, that the state can expedite processing of emergency water transfer applications, and these are temporary, and all the other requirements are still in place, including mitigation. The only difference is ecology can process in 15 days. And second, we can open up drought response grant funds to support public entities to address the water supply issues they are facing from these drought conditions. And the eligible entities for these grants are tribes, cities, counties, utility, irrigation, conservation districts, those listed here. As well as ecology can also use drought funds under a drought declaration for interagency agreements for the ways that other state agencies are uniquely positioned to respond to drought, as well as the state drought declaration currently opens up eligibility for some federal funding and serves as an important communication tool, especially as we're seeing these patterns with snowpack drought happen at increasing frequencies, both in the last 10 years and likely going forward. And when we talk about drought response projects under these grants, here are a quick few examples. For agriculture, that can be purchasing or leasing water rights, and we saw that happen last year in the summer. And for small rural water systems, that can be the transportation of emergency water supplies or trucking of water. We saw that happen in 2023. Or for fisheries, eliminating migration barriers that may get built in rivers and streams in the summer. And in terms of ongoing drought management, I just want to highlight where we are here again in February of 2025. And as I mentioned, ecology and our partners are continuing to evaluate conditions throughout winter, but we're not going to be rescinding the current drought declaration early unless there was clear evidence of snowpack recovery beyond what's normal for January or February, but to make sure we actually have adequate water supply for that April through September period. So that's where seeing how snowpack gets us to points in March and April is really important, since that snowpack is so important for water supply for April through September and rivers and streams across the state. And for those thinking about a drought response application at this point in time, I do want to highlight while these applications are still open, any drought response applications that come in this winter must be to address continued water supply issues from 24 drought conditions. And when we look at applications, we need to see some sort of evidence, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, that the water supply issue that a public entity is facing is due to drought conditions. And I highlight that because there can be a range of factors that contribute to water supply issues, whether it's aging infrastructure or general declines in an aquifer. And with that, I will now pass it over to Karen with the Washington State Climatology Office, and Michelle will get those slides going. Thank you all.
Thanks, Caroline. All right, looks good. Good morning, everyone. My name's Karen Bumbacco. I'm with the Washington State Climate Office. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Perfect. So taking a look at our water year conditions so far, on the left-hand side, we have our temperature departure from normal since October 1st, so going through last week. And we're not as warm as I had presented last time because we've just had a pretty cool January. But still overall, we are on the warmer side for the start of the water year. So looking at October through January, we tie as the 18th warmest start to the water year. This is going back to 1895, so many, many years. What was interesting here is we're actually exactly tied with last year. So tying October 2023 through January 2024 in terms of our temperature anomaly. And we are also tying 2005, 2000, and 1908 for these warmer temperatures to the start here. Average statewide, much below normal precipitation west of the Cascades now, looking at October through January, above normal for further eastern Washington. That's dragging the whole statewide total down, and overall we're at about 88% of normal precipitation for the water year so far, and that's not what we want to see when we're hoping for drought recovery. Next slide, please. So here's January. We had a really unique pattern set up in where there was a temperature inversion for most of the month, meaning that our temperatures were warmer in our mountainous areas and cooler in our lower elevations. And you can see that in the plot on the left there, just the blue, cooler than normal temperatures in the lower parts of the state, and then normal to above normal in the mountains. Average statewide, it was pretty near normal. That's sort of canceled out, but cooler in the places where people live. January was extremely dry. So especially Western Washington throughout the Cascades, looking at less than 50% of our normal January precipitation. This is concerning because January, we tend to get a lot of precipitation. It's our third wettest month climatologically, so behind November and December. And then averaged across the state, we rank as the fifth driest January. So the first driest was 1985, followed by 1949, 1963, and then 1977. 1977 jumps out to me because that was a drought year for Washington State. So average just at about 35% of normal precipitation. Again, not what we want to see. Also interesting is we ran some numbers and we also had an unusually high number of dry days throughout the month. So Quileute, for example, had 20 dry days, which is the second longest or the second most in January since the records began in 1967. Seattle had the same 20 dry days for January, very unusual. And that was the fifth most since records began in 1945. We also had an unusually low amount of cloud cover because the pattern that set up, we had sunny skies, which we don't usually see in January. Across the state, we had between 15 and 30% fewer clouds than we usually see in January. So it was a weird month. Next slide, please. I pulled this up. This is an experimental product that shows the odds of reaching normal precipitation by the end of the water year, and it's based on how much precipitation has already fallen. So this is through January. This is as of February 1st. And then how much has historically been observed through the remaining months of the water year. So for Western Washington, and across the Cascades, there's a really low probability that we're going to get back up to normal precipitation for the water year, just because our wettest time of year is a little bit in the rearview mirror. So you can see there, the kind of those white colors are less than a 10% chance that we'll have normal water year precipitation there. Thankfully, east of the Cascades, they've seen more precipitation and are already on track to be normal, if not above. All right, next slide, please. I just wanted to quickly show February so far, just the first 7 days of February, showing that that pattern has remained with really dry conditions, drier than usual, and cold temperatures too. The temperatures are surprisingly cold. That scale there is hard to see, but goes down to about 14 degrees Fahrenheit. That darkest blue color below normal. Again, it's only a week, so we have more of February to see how the monthly stats shake out. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this. This is the snow drought tracker. Matt, of course, will be talking much more about our snowpack. But this is from the Western Regional Climate Center, and it's a little complicated to look at, but I just pulled two SNOTEL sites that have below median snowpack in the Central and North Cascades now. So that's Stampede Pass on the left and Harts Pass on the right. And these kind of follow the water year. On the y-axis is the snowpack percent of median, and then on the x-axis is the accumulated precipitation for the water year, a percent of normal. And so you can see kind of the yellow dots there are just at the start of February, and they are, below normal snowpack and below normal precipitation, sitting around like 60% of median for both in Stampede Pass, maybe 65% of median for Harts Pass. For both SWE and precipitation. And it's just showing that this is what scientists are referring to as snowpack drought. So we're seeing not as much snowpack as we want to see, and it's due to dry conditions mostly, since it's kind of down on that quadrant of this plot here. So next slide, please. This is the current drought monitor, just came out this morning. There's been an increase in abnormally dry conditions and moderate drought in Western Washington, responding to sort of the last 6 weeks of really dry conditions that we've seen. On the right-hand side there, that is the change in the drought monitor since our last meeting. So worsening west of the Cascades, some improvement east of the Cascades, still kind of a hanging over or a holdover from our wet December that we had. Reminder, December was pretty warm and wet. Next slide, please. All right, so we're still in a La Nina. It's a weak La Nina, but expecting to stick around through spring. The left-hand kind of probability plot, that is fresh and came out this morning, showing that we're more likely to switch to neutral conditions in March through May. So that it's a 66% chance now, which is higher than when I presented last month. And I wanted to point out here in the sea surface temperature anomaly plot that there's still a lot of warmth in the equatorial Pacific and the Pacific in general. So several meetings ago, I was going on and on about a relative index for La Nina. We have a new staff at the climate office that actually just did I think, a great write-up on that. I'm going to put that link in the chat so you all can read more about that when I'm done speaking. Next slide, please. So Climate Prediction Center outlook for February, still going below normal temperatures. That seems like a really good forecast considering how the month has started. A higher probability of above normal precipitation, feeling a little less certain about that, although it does look like we have a pattern change coming up this weekend. I'll defer to my National Weather Service and National Forecast Center colleagues to go more into that, but overall, they're still tilting us towards a wetter February, which I hope does come true. Next slide, please. And then this is also what we've sort of been saying all winter, cooler than normal temperatures. Hey, that's turning out to be a good forecast with above normal precipitation. This is for March to May. The February through April 3-month forecast had higher odds of both of those outcomes, so consistently showing cooler temperatures and higher probability of wetter conditions. Next slide. This is looking at those kind of national multi-model ensembles. So the top plot there is an average of all the models below, and then the little thumbnails below are individual seasonal forecast models. Not too emphatic about the cooler than normal temperatures. If anything, it looks more near normal to these models for March through May. The international multi-model ensemble is in the lower right, and that's also showing near normal. Next slide, please. But still precipitation, there's more consistency here, which is good news, with higher chances of above normal precipitation for most of Western Washington, including the Cascades and Olympics. We're seeing that in the NMME and the IMME on the bottom right there. Next slide, please. All right, so to summarize, water temperatures have been above normal, despite even our cool recent temperatures. They're still trending that way overall for the water year, tying as the 18th warmest and tying last year. Water year precipitation has been drier than normal across Western Washington and above normal across Eastern Washington. January was pretty much extremely dry statewide, the 5th driest. Our weak La Nina is here, but looks to be dissipating in the spring, or a higher chance of that happening for the March, April, May period. And our forecasts are still showing indications for below normal temperatures and above normal precipitation. I did want to note, I always check in with Nick Bond, our emeritus state climatologist, before talking to you all in these meetings, and he was mentioning something that stuck out to him is some of those experimental 3 to 4 week forecasts that are put out by seasonal forecast models. We're looking not so wet for early March. So that's also a little bit tentative on that wet forecast. But, there's always the second half of March and April for that to verify. So with that, I'll close.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Really appreciated the different perspectives, some of the different graphics you showed there. I have one follow-up question before we go to Matt. And this question, I acknowledge the answer may be like, we'll have to see as we get later on this season. But I'm curious with some of the Climate Prediction Center forecasts that we saw earlier on and that were, previously also predicting wetter and colder above normal. And then we ended up having this January that didn't quite match that. And I'm curious if you think it's like the differences in these models are kind of what, if you have any sort of initial thoughts about some of those discrepancies in the CPC forecast and what we actually saw.
Yeah, it's always tough. I mean, a lot of times when we look at the CPC outlooks, we're looking at 3 months as a whole. So, even if we were to look back, from December, January, February, like the weather forecasts still came true for Eastern Washington, even despite that sort of within that period variability of the extremely dry January, it just wasn't foreseen even in our forecast models, like our short-term forecast models. It kept showing we're going to switch the pattern. We're going to get out of this,
Mm.
dry, cold, sunny pattern, and it just kept pushing it out. Like we would get closer and say, nope, got another week of it. Nope, got another week of it. So it really was not foreseen for those longer term forecasts.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any other quick questions for Karen before we move to Matt? Cool. Well, Karen, I appreciate you staying on for any discussion time that comes up after presentations. Thank you again for all of that. Matt, we will turn to you.
All right, sounds good. Go ahead and get my screen share set up. Okay. All right. You should be seeing the first slide here.
Yep.
Awesome. So go ahead and dive into it. Coming to you from a snowy Portland this morning. Starting out with snowpack conditions, looking at the statewide profile plot. Snowpack is 87% of normal statewide and 60% of median peak. So the current snowpack trend is this black line. And then I threw up last year's snowpack profile, which is the sort of brownish orangish color. You can see we're doing a bit better, but still below the median. All right, and taking a step back before we dip into Washington a bit more, looking at west-wide snowpack, can see pretty prevalent snow drought conditions in the southwestern portions of the West. And I always like sort of this zoomed out picture because you can see where a lot of the storm tracks and active storm cycles have been. And so far this winter, storm cycles and their tracks have been fairly consistent in that a lot of these impacts have favored the Northern California and Southern Oregon coast, with additional, more significant impacts moving into the interior of Oregon and into the Snake River Basin in Idaho. And up in Washington, unfortunately, impacts have not favored much of the state, but we do see some bright areas, particularly in the southern Cascades in Washington, as well as if we ventured a bit east of the crest in the central upper Columbia, as well as the lower Wenatchees, where we're seeing near to slightly above normal snowpack for this time of year. Now, getting into Washington, the map on the left is showing snowpack or snow water equivalent SWE as percent of normal. And on the right is just percentile based on that normal period. I like sort of showing that because it just really pinpoints the areas where we're seeing exceptionally low snowpack compared to that 30-year time frame. And looking at the percent of normal map, the basin and site map on the left, we can see that much of the state is below normal for snowpack this time of year, with the exception of the lower Snake Basin, Walla Walla Basin, and the lower Columbia. Areas where we're seeing pretty exceptionally low snowpack is the central Washington Cascades, in addition to the region around Washington Pass and the North Cascades. So, sort of at the intersection of Lake Chelan, that lower part of the Skagit, and also the Methow Basin. All right, moving into precipitation conditions at SNOTEL stations. Again, first looking at the statewide water year-to-date precipitation profile plot. Statewide water year-to-date precipitation is 80% of normal, or if we're just looking at the percentile, be ranked 27th. I again plotted the profile from last year, which is that orangish brown color. Black is this year, and green is the median or normal profile. And kind of a reverse of snowpack, we're doing a bit worse than last year in terms of water year to date precipitation, um, just below normal at this point. Looking at the site and basin map for water year to date precipitation, I can see many basins experiencing a slight deficit, and in particular the upper Yakima, um, which is experiencing more of a moderate precipitation deficit. And then some of those sites around Washington Pass, again, we're seeing a fairly low water year to date precipitation values, similar to the snowpack values there. Not too many sites above normal in terms of water year to date precipitation, just a couple sites in the upper Columbia. Lower Columbia, still some moisture deficits despite more healthy snowpack. Some stations showing more near normal water year to date precipitation conditions, while other stations are showing slightly below normal water year to date precipitation. And then on the peninsula, just to call that out since I haven't done that yet, water year to date precipitation is 81% of normal. All right, looking at month-to-date precipitation and also the precipitation in January that Karen already touched on was just extraordinarily poor across much of the state, notably across the Cascades and on the peninsula. So far, month-to-date, precipitation fairly well for the northern blues and portions of the lower Columbia around the Mount St. Helens. But in general, precipitation conditions are still quite poor across many of the major basins in the state. And I usually show a map when I talk about compounding deficits, but I wanted to show these three plots this time. And the time frame for each of these plots differs a bit, but it shows three basins. And it really underlines sort of the moisture deficits that we're seeing in some parts of the state, not only from this water year, but also last water year. So the first one is the Lake Chelan Basin, looking back from 2015 until now, we're experiencing the largest deficit in terms of precipitation within that period. Similarly with the Methow Basin, and perhaps more significantly with the Upper Yakima, where we're experiencing a pretty significant or more significant precipitation deficit, multi-year precipitation deficit. And that graph, that plot is going back until 2005. So just touching on, again, the importance of considering not only this year in terms of moisture deficits, whether that's precipitation, SWE, or combined, but looking at multiple years and what impacts that may have on water supply and more persistent drought conditions or regions' ability to recover from drought. So I thought these were just some cool plots to show. Touching on soil moisture conditions, at the root zone, so 0 to 100 centimeters, showing both the NASA Grace product on the left and then the NASA Sport Lease product on the right. And for once, these actually line up pretty well. I shouldn't say for once. It doesn't really happen often. There always seems to be some pretty significant discrepancies, but it seems like for the most part, both of these products are capturing the same relatively dry soil conditions, notably across the Cascades, where we're seeing some indications of very dry soil conditions, as well as parts of the lower Snake, lower Pend Oreille, and then on the Olympic Peninsula. So those areas that I noted are pretty consistent across both of these products. All right, touching on our water supply outlook or forecast that we released on February 1st. Again, the percentiles just kind of show where we're seeing sort of those lowest forecasts based on the 30-year normal period. It's just helpful to see But for the most part, if we look at this percent of normal map on the left, we can see generally near normal forecast across much of the Cascades. And again, or I guess more notably in the western part of the Cascades on the peninsula. And again, these forecasts, at least this early in the season, and with these being inherently more rain dominated basins on the west side, these forecasts won't trend too far away from the climatological norm. If we move over to the east side of the crest, we can see more below normal forecasts, and these are the 50% exceedance predictions across much of eastern Washington, with the exception of more near normal forecasted flows in southeastern Washington. And then note too that looking at the percentile, we see some red dots, and a lot of those are falling along the upper Columbia. So you might remember the pretty good snowpack conditions in the central upper Columbia Basin. But as we moved up into the British Columbia in the mountains up there, and then over to the east further into Montana and Idaho, looking at sort of the central and upper portions of the Pend Oreille Basin, snowpack varies quite a bit more, with some more below normal snowpack in those regions, in addition to below normal precipitation. So that's having a pretty significant impact on flows and forecasts that we're seeing along both the Okanagan and the Upper Columbia. All right, looking ahead. So I haven't included this before, but these are SWE projection or snowpack projection plots. That's just entirely based on the period of record data set. And so I thought this would be kind of an interesting thing to show. And what that red arrow is pointing at is generally the peak, sort of that middle projection point, or that 50% projection. And the blue is pointing towards or near the median peak SWE, or the normal. And so for what basins do I have up here? The Upper Yakima, the Skagit, and statewide, the projections so far, given the current snowpack conditions, is that the snowpack, the Warty peak snowpack, will be below normal. Of course, that can change with storm events, but that's just the current projection based on current conditions in the period of record data set. And just giving a brief overview of forecast, what to expect for future snow. Not too much in the way of atmospheric river events providing any additional moisture over the next 7 days. This is the CW3E forecast. However, we are expected over this next period up and through February 18th to receive additional snow accumulation across the Cascades, in addition to precipitation, but more focus on the southern Cascades in Washington, and also parts of central Cascades in Washington as well. So less so you'll see in the North Cascades, so around the Mount Baker region, where we're seeing some pretty low snowpack. Yeah, good news is that there is at least snow in the forecast, I guess. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. Yeah, I just want to say, definitely appreciate you showing some of those different snowpack graphs and the pieces about compounding deficits, particularly for Yakima, as well as that Skagit piece, and the piece that you highlighted for compounding precipitation deficits as well for Okanagan and Methow. Yeah, very much appreciate those different perspectives and data angles. Any questions for Matt about what he presented? Matt, I'm curious with the soil moisture piece and what you acknowledge that so often those different products don't match. Do you think there's anything that led to them matching right now with conditions, or that just kind of just be a coincidence right now?
I'm not really sure. Sometimes when they don't line up, it's sort of a mystery. I'm sure the people that produce those products will have would have a thorough response. But it's nice to see sort of very similar patterns statewide and not just in specific areas. Um, yeah, I guess no real answer to that question.
Sure. No, that's fair. Great. Well, thank you. So before we go to Mick with Borough Reclamation, I'm going to do a quick screen share of one USGS tool since Nick from USGS is not able to join us today. But I do want to briefly show where Streamflow is at today. And so here we have our National Water Dashboard, one of the many great tools that USGS puts out there. And for those that don't look at this every morning, here we see a lot of red, which is not good. Again, red shows significantly below normal, orange below normal in terms of stream flow for today, February 13th, compared to that normal everyone's been talking about. And again, while this is not fully indicative of what we expect to see for April to September stream flow, still concerning, but as Karen and Matt have shared, there's still hopefully more precipitation to come here shortly, particularly this weekend. So these red dots does not mean this is what we'll see going forward. But again, for areas where we've got those compounding deficits and some concerns for snowpack, still some concerns, but just highlighting across the Olympics, across the west side, and then a little bit of mixed with green as normal and red in parts of central and east side. And where you see the gray, that means there's some ice on that site there. But did just want to share this for folks since Nick is not here. Yeah. And I see the gray dot question there, and that is for ice and conditions. And with that, we'll have Michelle share Mick slides. We have Mick from Borough Reclamation, and then after Mick, Amy with the Northwest River Forecast Center.
So I will present in place of course Yakima situation. So the first slide is showing precipitation and temperature at the Yakima airport. So as we can see, January was basically, except of first event at the beginning of the month, completely flat. We had small precipitation in February, but it's above average here, and however it all comes from December being way above average with precipitation. Temperature was in the middle range and with and below average, especially second half of January and February. Next slide, please. For precipitation, which was measured at 5 reservoirs, January was only 34.9% of average. And for entire basin, we are at 70.9% of average. So it was already alluded before that we are very dry. Next slide, please. Snowpack. So we have comparison with our measurements and from NRCS. So we're in general in the lower to upper 80s, and Natchez part of the watershed is definitely having more snow compared to other parts of the basin. For the entire Yakima, we are at 82%, so below average conditions, and February so far is not very good. The next one. Some plot of SWE from today. So as we can see, there's here some climbing, but we are like way below average. And I picked a few similar years from the last decades. So you can see that most of these years melt-off happens sooner than average, and they are on the dry side. Next slide, please. Again, the map with Yakima showing 87% of average with sweep from today. Next one. Unregulated flows for the system. So system is the outflow measured at 5 reservoirs. So we were only at, so basically it's the inflow to 5 reservoirs. So we are only at 53% of what we usually expect to get. The next slide. The actual flow out of the reservoirs was at 74% of average. The next one. The next one slide is showing unregulated flow, which would arrive at Parker. Parker is the site slightly downstream from the city of Yakima, and flow again was only at 52% of average. So it's the unregulated flow. So basically what would have got there if there was no regulation on reservoirs. The next slide. And regulated flow was only at 60% of average. So so it's quite low. Next one. So so this one, I think, can I go to the next one slide? Okay, the next slide is showing situation with the storage, how much water we have in our reservoir. So it's the lowest third since 1971, and we are only at 34% full. So it's very little storage. It's only 193,000 acre-feet of water in 5 reservoirs. Next one, please. Some historical comparison. So as I mentioned, we are the third driest year, some similar years, 88, 93, 94. So all these were drought years. And I think it was the last slide which I was presenting.
Thank you very much, Mick. And I appreciate you sharing those pieces with historical comparison for other drought years and where storage is for Yakima. For Ecology, we're definitely watching those storage numbers that have been around 33, 34%, seemingly just staying around that number, and definitely seeing that as a concerning piece for what that will mean for water supply this spring and summer and early fall. Any quick questions for Mick before we go to Amy? Great. Well, Amy, I will pass it over to you. Thank you.
All right. You're seeing that, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is us. There's a whole team of us. I'm a hydrologist here at the River Forecast Center, but you've got service hydrologist servicing the various areas of Washington. Jumping right in to precipitation and temperature. That, of course, Karen covered very well already, but on a different geographic scale and different color scheme. Very dry January and February for Washington, and quite cold, especially during the start of February. Also, I should note, we're not, all the way through February, obviously. So the seasonal precipitation pattern is seen here on the far right graphic. And again, eastern side of Washington is looking slightly more optimistic than this west, which is in oranges and yellows, indicating less than average amounts of precipitation since October 1st. Looking at the precipitation snowpack and observed runoff so far together, just on one slide, definitely seeing all sorts of colors indicating both above and below normal throughout the state, but Overall, you can see that low precipitation on the west side coincides with oranges and yellows here for our snowpack numbers at the SNOTEL stations that Matt covered. You can also see those same oranges up there in the Canadian pillows, reflecting the same weather pattern of just a lack of mountain snow. And the runoff since October 1st, so this is the volume of water as a percent normal at river points, much lower than normal on these west point sides. In fact, all over the state, we're seeing less than normal amounts, oranges, reds, and yellows. Looking ahead to what's forecast to come in the next 10 days in terms of precipitation, and these are the forecasts that are currently incorporated into our ESP10 water supply forecasts. This far left-hand graphic is showing that there are quite a few inches expected to fall in the next 10 days, although I have to agree with Karen's take that the forecasts this year have not always verified. So I think that precipitation has more than not come in less than forecast. So yes, the left-hand graphic shows the amount of inches expected to fall, but these right-hand side graphics, the middle and far right, show that there's less than normal amounts expected to fall in these wetter portions of the state, namely Olympic Peninsula and Northwest Washington. These greens here show more than normal amounts expected to fall in the southern areas, or just normal amounts over there in eastern Washington. And that same information is reflected here on the right-hand side as a percent of normal, as kind of pops those wet and dry areas out more. So we'll see what happens with this. Hopefully some snowpack building, but it could come in less than forecast, as we've seen recently. So now moving to the actual April through September forecasts as they currently stand as of yesterday. On the right-hand side here, we're looking at the seasonal forecasts. Again, these are the volumes of water expected to flow through the rivers, expressed as a percent normal for the April through September period. So these yellows indicate less than normal amounts. The greens indicate closer to normal amounts. But I will say, looking at these forecasts and comparing them to the left-hand numbers, which is the observed since the beginning of the water year, October 1st, they seem optimistic. They seem a little high for me. So if you have the ability to look at a spread of the forecasts, these are probabilistic forecasts, so they all have a spread. I would encourage you to look at the lower end of that spread at this point. Some people don't have the luxury of choosing which portion of the spread they look at. But overall, looking at these greens, my mind just goes to those are probably a little too high right now. And Matt had the foresight to show his forecasts, NRCS forecasts, as a percentile. So I quickly added this map because I was like, yes, that's a great idea. I should have done that. So thank you, Matt. So if you look at these same forecasts as a percentile, you see these reds pop out. So percentile is often just a better way of showing the extremes. I think that's all I've got today. Main takeaways are January and February so far have been cold and dry. Runoff since October 1st has been largely below normal, in some cases well below normal. Precipitation forecasts for the next 10 days are a mix of above and below normal. And April through September river forecasts have dropped. I failed to mention that. They have dropped significantly since last we talked. But I still think they're a little overdone, and they are a mix of normal and below. I'm going to have to jump off after this, but I could take any questions before I go.
Cool. Thank you very much, Amy. I have one quick question. I was wondering if you'd share just a little bit more about why you think it'd be better to look at the lower end of the probabilistic forecast when looking at the different products.
Yeah, I mean, most of it is me just looking at the maps and thinking, there is not a lot of optimism in all the observed parameters that we track. So why do we think that things are going to get better? Past the 10 days, the precipitation and temperature that we incorporate in these long-term models is the spread, the historic spread. So essentially, that's always going to trend towards normal, which I believe Matt was talking about his forecast doing that as well. So I think if we continue to see the snowpack fail to develop, the forecast will start to trend lower. But if you're looking at the CPC forecasts, if you're looking at long-term forecasts out there that are indicating the snowpack we're not headed for a miraculous recovery, I would start to look at the lower end of the spread. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. I think it's a good reminder for folks around the fact that, after those 10 days, those the 30-year normals are used in the forecast, and then what that means for how well the forecast may be speaking to what may be more likely to happen or not.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Any other quick questions for Amy? I always like to look for both virtual and physical raised hands. I'm not seeing anything. So Amy, thank you very much for your time here today. Always appreciated.
Thank you.
And Michelle, if you want to go ahead and stop the recording, that would be great.